Chosen one, pause for a moment and listen carefully. What you're about to hear is not random, and it's not gossip. This situation has gone far beyond whispers and hidden intentions. Proof has been collected. Actions that were done to you in silence are now coming into the light. You didn't have to expose anyone. Truth did that on its own. Authorities are now involved because what was meant to harm you crossed a line. You were protected when you didn't even realize it. Stay with this message because what's unfolding now is not revenge. It's justice aligning in your favor. Before you get lost in this video, you must first do 3 things to connect with God's energy. First, you must like the video and then leave a comment. Thank you, God, for choosing me. And finally, you must send your signal to the universe by subscribing to the channel. What they did was not small. It crossed a line. For a long time, you did exactly what most good-hearted people try to do when something feels wrong. You stayed calm. You told yourself not to overreact. You tried to forgive quickly, to move on quietly, to keep peace instead of creating noise. You stayed silent because you didn't want drama, conflict, or unnecessary trouble. You thought that if you just stayed patient, things would naturally settle down. But what happened to you was not something small that could simply fade with time. It wasn't just a misunderstanding or a moment of emotional hurt. What this person did crossed a real line, one that separates discomfort from harm and silence from accountability. At first, it may have looked harmless on the surface. Maybe it started with words that felt off, behavior that made you uneasy, or actions that didn't sit right in your spirit. You might not have been able to fully explain it back then, but deep inside, something told you, this isn't okay. Over time, those words turned into actions. Those intentions turned into patterns. And those patterns slowly created real consequences. You weren't imagining it. You weren't being sensitive. You were being aware. What makes this even heavier is that you were targeted in ways you didn't fully understand at the time. You were dealing with the effects before you could even see the cause. That's why it felt confusing. One moment you were questioning yourself, and the next moment you were feeling drained, unsettled, or weighed down emotionally. When harm is subtle, it often makes the victim doubt themselves first. But confusion does not mean innocence. It often means manipulation. That's also why this situation didn't simply disappear when you stayed quiet. Silence doesn't erase truth. Ignoring something doesn't undo its impact. Some actions are too serious to dissolve on their own. They don't fade just because you chose peace. They don't vanish because you didn't speak up immediately. Instead, they build pressure beneath the surface. They leave marks. They leave trails. They leave evidence. And this is an important realization. Escalation doesn't happen without reason. When something grows instead of shrinking, it's usually because it was never small to begin with. You tried to minimize it, but reality refused to cooperate. Life itself started responding. Situations aligned. Truth began surfacing in ways you didn't plan. That's not coincidence. That's consequence. Understand this clearly. Crossing a line always triggers a response, even if it takes time. You didn't cause this outcome. You didn't invite it. You didn't exaggerate it. You simply reached the point where truth could no longer stay hidden. And now, what was once ignored is being acknowledged. Not because you demanded it, but because some things are too serious to remain unseen forever. Proof exists because truth leaves traces. One of the most powerful things you need to understand right now is that you were never meant to chase proof. You were never required to defend yourself, explain every detail, or convince people of what you went through. You didn't need to collect screenshots, record conversations, or build a file against anyone. That was never your role. Truth has its own way of surviving, even when no one is trying to preserve it. It leaves traces naturally, the same way footprints remain on a path long after someone has walked away. Every action a person takes creates a pattern. Every word spoken leaves an echo. Every choice made in secret eventually interacts with reality. Messages don't disappear the way people think they do. Behavior repeats itself. Habits expose intention. Over time, these small details begin to connect like pieces of a puzzle. What once looked isolated starts forming a clear picture. That's how truth works. It doesn't rush, but it never forgets. What makes this situation especially meaningful is what you were doing while all of this was happening. You weren't plotting. You weren't watching them closely. You weren't trying to catch anyone in the act. You were healing. You were trying to breathe again. You were focusing on your peace, your sanity, and your forward movement. While you were choosing growth over revenge, reality was quietly taking notes. That alone should tell you that you were protected. Divine protection doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like being removed from chaos before it collapses. While you were stepping back, truth kept moving forward. People noticed inconsistencies. Stories didn't match. Behavior raised questions. Witnesses came forward naturally, not because you asked them to, but because patterns become impossible to ignore over time. This is why you didn't have to expose anyone. Exposure driven by emotion often creates confusion, but exposure driven by reality brings clarity. When truth rises on its own, it carries weight. It doesn't need exaggeration. It doesn't need persuasion. It stands firm because it's supported by facts, not feelings. That's why what's unfolding now feels solid instead of chaotic. When God fights for you, He doesn't ask you to exhaust yourself proving what happened. He allows reality to speak louder than explanations ever could. Doors open without you knocking. Answers appear without you chasing them. Proof forms without you forcing it. This isn't luck. This isn't coincidence. This is alignment. So if you ever doubted whether staying quiet was the right decision, let this be your confirmation. Your silence didn't weaken your position, it strengthened it. While you chose peace, truth chose persistence. And now, everything that needed to be seen is being seen. Not because you demanded justice, but because truth always finds its way to the surface. Authorities are involved because silence ran out. When a situation reaches the point where authorities become involved, it means one simple thing. Silence has reached its limit. Silence can cover small misunderstandings, minor mistakes, or issues that fade with time. But it cannot hide real damage forever. When harm becomes serious, repeated, or impactful, it naturally moves beyond private spaces. At that point, outside intervention becomes necessary. This is not about creating noise or seeking attention. It is about responsibility stepping in, where denial once lived. You stayed quiet longer than most people would have. You gave space. You allowed time. You hoped that things would correct themselves without escalation. But some situations don't heal through patience alone. When the damage affects safety, dignity, or well-being, it demands recognition. That's when silence stops protecting and starts enabling. And that shift is what triggers intervention. Not because someone complained loudly, but because reality itself demanded action. This moment also reveals a major miscalculation on their part. They believed your quiet nature meant weakness. They assumed your restraint meant permission. They thought that because you didn't react emotionally or publicly, there would never be consequences. But staying silent does not erase impact. It only delays exposure. Actions still carry weight, even when no one immediately responds. That weight eventually becomes too heavy to ignore. Authorities don't get involved because of feelings. They respond to patterns, seriousness, and evidence. Their presence means the situation crossed from personal discomfort into something that affects order, safety, or accountability. That alone confirms that what happened was not imagined, exaggerated, or minor. It reached a threshold where it could no longer remain a private issue. What's important here is understanding that this intervention did not happen because you pushed for it. You didn't force anyone's hand. You didn't demand punishment. The system moved because balance was needed. Justice is not emotional. It's corrective. It steps in when imbalance threatens stability. That's why this moment feels heavy, but also clarifying. There is also a deeper lesson unfolding. Higher systems step in when personal boundaries are ignored for too long. This isn't just about one situation. It's about restoring order. When people act without regard for consequence, they eventually meet structures designed to contain harm. That's how accountability works. This is a turning point where truth is no longer negotiable. Silence served its purpose, but it was never meant to carry everything forever. Now, responsibility has taken over. Not to create chaos, but to restore balance where it was broken. You were protected, even when you felt exposed. There were moments when you truly felt exposed. Moments when your guard was down, when confusion replaced clarity, and when fear quietly asked questions your mind couldn't answer. You may have felt like you were standing alone, unsure of who to trust or what was coming next. In those moments, it was natural to ask, why is this happening to me? When things don't make sense, the heart often assumes it has been left unprotected. But what you felt on the surface was not the full picture. Protection doesn't always look like instant relief. Sometimes it looks like survival. It looks like being removed from situations before they collapse. It looks like delays that feel frustrating, but later make sense. While you were trying to hold yourself together, something greater was holding the situation in place. You were not abandoned. You were covered in ways you couldn't see yet. While others were acting carelessly, you were being guided away from deeper harm. While they believed they were unnoticed, the timing of everything was quietly shifting. Events were aligning, not randomly, but intentionally. You may not have seen immediate justice, but you were being positioned for clarity instead of chaos. That's a different kind of protection, one that focuses on long-term safety rather than short-term comfort. God often works silently. He doesn't always interrupt situations loudly. Instead, he limits damage. He places boundaries around what can and cannot reach you. Even when you felt emotionally shaken, there were things that never touched you because they were blocked before you ever became aware of them. That is protection you only recognize in hindsight. There's also a reason why clarity arrived slowly instead of all at once. If everything had been revealed immediately, it might have overwhelmed you. Instead, you were allowed to grow stronger, wiser, and more grounded before the truth surfaced. Protection sometimes includes preparation. You were being strengthened internally so that when revelation came, it wouldn't break you. What they thought was success was actually delay. What they believed was escape was only temporary. Timelines don't bend to intention. They bend to truth. While you focused on healing, reality was adjusting itself. Truth was waiting for the right moment to surface in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. And this is where protection transforms into revelation. The same force that shielded you quietly is now allowing truth to be seen clearly. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was random. What felt like exposure was actually a controlled moment designed to keep you safe while the bigger picture unfolded. You were protected all along, just not in the way you expected. This is not revenge. It is correction. It's very important to understand what this moment truly represents, because many people confuse correction with revenge. Revenge comes from anger, pain, and the desire to hurt back. It is emotional and often chaotic. What is happening now is completely different. This is correction. Correction is calm. It is measured. It is about restoring what was thrown out of balance. You are not watching someone suffer because you wanted them to. You are witnessing truth take its rightful place. You don't need to feel excited about anyone's downfall, and you don't need to feel guilty for what's unfolding either. Feeling guilty would mean you caused this outcome, but you didn't. Consequences are not created by the person who was harmed. They are created by the choices of the person who crossed the line. Accountability is the natural result of action, not a punishment invented by the victim. Correction doesn't require celebration. It requires acceptance. This is why your heart may feel calm instead of satisfied. You may not feel the urge to say, "They deserve this." Instead, you may feel a quiet understanding that things are finally being addressed properly. That's because justice, when it's real, doesn't stir ego. It settles the soul. Another important truth is that balance must exist in every system: emotional, social, and spiritual. When someone disrupts that balance through repeated harmful behavior, correction becomes necessary. This isn't about making them pay. It's about stopping the pattern. Correction exists to prevent further damage, not to entertain revenge. Justice also does not need your permission. You didn't have to ask for it. You didn't have to demand it. You didn't even have to believe it would happen. Justice arrives on its own timing, not according to emotional readiness. It shows up when truth has enough weight to stand on its own. That's why this moment feels inevitable rather than forced. You are not responsible for how others feel when truth catches up to them. You are not required to soften consequences for the sake of their comfort. Compassion does not mean protecting people from accountability. Sometimes compassion means allowing reality to teach the lesson you were never meant to deliver yourself. This is also why you can move forward without bitterness. Correction clears space. It closes loops. It allows healing to continue without unfinished business. Nothing about this moment asks you to look back with anger. Instead, it invites you to stand firm, grounded in the knowledge that balance has been restored. Their panic is the proof. You were right. When people are confident in their actions, they remain steady. Their behavior stays consistent. They don't rush to explain, hide, or change their story. That's why sudden panic is so revealing. If you're noticing nervous movements, forced calmness, awkward silence, or defensive reactions, understand this clearly. This is not strength. This is fear showing itself. Fear only appears when someone realizes the ground beneath them is no longer solid. You may have noticed how their energy shifted. Someone who once spoke freely now chooses words carefully. Someone who was once bold has become quiet. Someone who once dismissed your feelings is now over-explaining or avoiding you altogether. These changes are not random. They are responses to pressure. Pressure appears when truth starts closing in. For a long time, You questioned your own perception. You wondered if you were overthinking, being too emotional, or imagining things. That's what happens when someone consistently dismisses your experience. But discernment often feels uncomfortable at first. It's a quiet inner signal that something isn't right, even when there's no obvious proof yet. You felt it before you could explain it. Now, reality is confirming what your spirit already picked up on. You're not watching panic because you're powerful. You're watching panic because truth is active. People only fear exposure when there's something to expose. Innocence doesn't hide. It doesn't scramble. It doesn't suddenly shift behavior. Fear is the body's reaction to consequences approaching. This is also why you no longer need to defend yourself. The situation is explaining itself. Their reactions are louder than any argument you could make. Silence, defensiveness, and sudden distance speak clearly to anyone who is paying attention. You don't have to point it out. You don't have to confront it. Truth doesn't need help announcing itself. There's also something deeply validating about this moment, not in a prideful way, but in a grounding way. It confirms that you are not wrong for trusting your instincts. You are not weak for feeling unsettled. You are not dramatic for sensing danger before others saw it. Discernment is quiet, but it's accurate. What you're witnessing now is not your victory. It's their realization. The realization that things they thought were buried are surfacing. The realization that silence no longer protects them. And the realization that you were never blind. You were aware. Let this moment bring you peace, not pride. You don't need to react. You don't need to respond. The panic you're seeing is proof enough. It's evidence that truth has entered the room. And once it does, nothing false can remain comfortable. Your role now is stillness, not explanation. Right now, your most powerful role is stillness. Not silence out of fear, not withdrawal out of exhaustion, but calm, grounded stillness that comes from knowing you no longer need to explain yourself. There was a time when explaining felt necessary, when you wanted to be understood, believed, or validated. That time has passed. Explaining now would only drain you and blur what is already becoming clear on its own. You do not need to prove your pain to anyone. Pain that had no impact would not have created consequences. Pain that was imaginary would not have left marks, patterns, or evidence. The fact that things are moving without your constant involvement is proof enough that your experience was real. Repeating your story will not make truth stronger. It will only exhaust you. Truth does not require repetition to survive. Staying calm in this moment is not weakness, it is alignment. When you remain steady, you allow contrast to reveal itself naturally. Your grounded energy stands quietly beside their reactions, and the difference becomes obvious without you saying a word. Calmness highlights truth. Emotional explanations often distract from it. There is also wisdom in letting systems do what they are designed to do. Systems rely on facts, timelines, and consistency, not emotion. By stepping back, you are allowing clarity to take its rightful place. You are trusting that what is solid will stand without your defense. This is not avoidance. This is confidence in truth's ability to carry itself. Validation is tempting, especially after a long period of being misunderstood. But chasing validation now would pull you backward into a role you've already outgrown. You don't need people to finally agree with you for truth to be valid. Agreement is optional. Reality is not. When truth is already moving ahead of you, chasing confirmation only slows your peace. Stillness also protects you. It keeps you from reacting impulsively, saying things you might later regret, or engaging in unnecessary conflict. When emotions run high around you, your calm becomes an anchor. It keeps you clear-headed and centered while everything else rearranges itself. This phase is about allowing space. Space for facts to speak. Space for clarity to settle. Space for outcomes to unfold without interference. Stillness gives truth room to breathe. It lets what's real rise naturally and what's false collapse on its own. Remember this: you are not being quiet because you have nothing to say. You are being still because everything that needs to be said is already being said through events, evidence, and timing. Your job now is not to convince, but to remain aligned. Stay grounded. Stay present. Let the movement ahead of you continue without resistance. You don't need to carry this anymore. Truth has already taken the lead. This is a turning point, not the end. What you are standing in right now is not an ending, even if it feels heavy or emotional. Endings feel final, like something has been taken from you. This moment is different. It is a turning point. It is the quiet shift where one chapter closes so another can begin with more clarity, strength, and peace than before. What is falling away was never meant to stay with you. It only stayed long enough to teach, reveal, and realign. One of the biggest changes happening now is that you are no longer carrying blame that was never yours to hold. For a long time, you questioned yourself. You replayed moments in your mind, wondering if you did something wrong, if you could have handled things better, if your reaction caused the situation. That weight slowly settles into the heart when truth is hidden. But now, that burden is being lifted. You are seeing clearly that what happened was not because of who you are, but because of choices someone else made. This turning point also brings a deep shift in how you see your own worth. When something painful drags on, it can quietly erode self-trust. You begin to doubt your instincts, your voice, your value. But now, clarity is restoring what confusion tried to take. You no longer need to ask yourself if you mattered. You mattered enough to be protected. You mattered enough for truth to surface. You mattered enough for balance to be restored. Another powerful realization is this: you were never unprotected. Even in moments when you felt exposed, even when answers were slow, there was a greater hand guiding the outcome. Protection does not always prevent discomfort, but it prevents destruction. You were allowed to bend, but not to break. You were allowed to feel, but not to be lost. That alone shows you were never alone. What's also becoming clear is that what tried to harm you could not survive its own weight. It didn't need your revenge or your reaction to be revealed. It exposed itself through repetition, inconsistency, and consequence. Truth doesn't need force. It only needs time. This moment is your release because you no longer have to carry what doesn't belong to you. You are free from defending your reality, free from questioning your perception, free from holding space for something that drained you. Release doesn't always feel like celebration. Sometimes it feels like quiet relief, like finally being able to breathe again. So don't mistake this shift for collapse. Nothing about this is breaking you down. It's setting you free. A chapter has closed, yes, but the next one opens with clarity, strength, and a deeper trust in yourself. This is not the end of your story. This is the moment where you step forward lighter than before.